Ready?
Sure.
All right. So thanks everyone for coming. We are the Next at UMBC group. We recently received a Hrabowski grant for research and innovation, and that grant explores connections between applied learning, affective development, and student success. My name is Hannah Schmitz. I work at the Shriver Center.
And I'm Michelle Wolf. I also work at the Shriver Center.
I'm Simon Stacey from the Honors College.
I'm Steve Freeland from Interdisciplinary Studies.
And I'm Elisa Kondosmy from the Applied Developmental Psychology program.
Okay. And we represent a work group of about 30 faculty and staff on campus. Before we get really into the history of what we have been up to, I just want to define a few things. So when we talk about applied learning, we're talking about it here at UMBC, and so that can happen curricularly, co-curricularly. It happens across divisions and schools. So it's really happening everywhere on campus. Just an overview of some of the types of applied learning that there are: service learning, internship and co-op, research, capstone projects, project-based learning, creative performance, student leadership, and study abroad. So those are just several overlying types of applied learning that exist. When we talk about affective development, we're talking about socio-emotional growth, so how students are internalizing their values, beliefs, and behaviors. So Michelle's going to lead it off with talking about the history of how we've gotten here, and then we're going to talk about the grant and some of the research that we found, and then where we're heading with this grant.
Yeah, so I'm going to start off with history of how this group came to be. We think it's important to understand that there's been decades worth of work related to applied learning experiences, folks doing great work across academic and student affairs for a very long time. So we're building on all of that work that's come before. We're focusing on, as Hannah mentioned, looking at the impact of applied learning on students' affective skills development because of some conversations and discussions that have been ongoing over the last couple decades. But there have been a couple points in time where things have come together, and we've decided to focus more intentionally on that. So the sort of origins of this group sort of date back to 2007. There were a series of working groups that Diane Lee had pulled together to look at student success in general. And some of those groups, there was one that focused on first year experience, one on transfer students, one on advising. And there was one that I had the opportunity to co-lead that was on sophomore success. So we're looking at, UMBC has a rather significant number of students who, after their second year, don't persist on to graduation. So we were looking at strategies for improving the success of that particular group. And the #1 recommendation from our group was institutionalizing applied learning as a distinctive opportunity for all UMBC students, with a focus, obviously, since we were the sophomore group, focusing on the students in their second year. As can happen with task force reports and that kind of activity, once the task force disbands, you lose momentum. So we sort of lost some momentum about intentionally looking at that as a strategy. But about 2 years ago, that conversation came up again. Diane and I were talking about, again, maybe reinvigorating the recommendations from that group. And at the same time, Diane was talking with Steve about how to institutionalize applied learning across interdisciplinary studies, the career of students in the INDS program. So we sort of brought those conversations together and then went a step further and went for a Breaking Ground grant to think about how we could improve communication and collaboration across the campus related to applied learning. So the summer of 2014, we had a group come together representing all of the colleges to talk about just that topic of how can we think about applied learning in a more intentional way, how it impacts students and their success. And out of that meeting, we came to a realization that on campus, often when we're talking about student learning outcomes and student success, we focus on their cognitive skills development. So the sheet that you have, the green side is Bloom's cognitive taxonomy and looks at skills development that has led to the creation of our general education functional competencies that you see at the bottom. So really focusing on the type of skills, sort of concrete, tangible skills like oral and written communication, technological competency, those kinds of things. Out of our discussion that summer, we realized that there is another taxonomy, the Bloom's affective domain. So we decided that we would like to see where we could have a research project that focused on the impact of applied learning on students' affective skills development. That group continued its work, and last fall we came together as a group, and through a series of discussions, sort of a democratic process of thinking about what can make up these affective skills that we wanted to assess, we came up with a set of what we call affective functional competencies. And that's, they're listed at the bottom of the sheet, the red side of the sheet. And we had, through the research and through a discussion, we came up with that, what we're calling AFCs, affective functional competencies, and then elements or factors that make up those different competencies. And you can see the elements listed under the titles of the competencies on the sheet. So out of that work, we decided that we wanted to start a research project to really see if we could assess students' development in those areas. And we decided that we would, two things, we'd launch a pilot study last spring with a small group of folks who were leading different types of applied learning experiences. And then we also applied for a Hrabowski Innovation Fund grant. And before folks go into the details around the grant and what happened in the spring and moving forward, just wanted to recognize and thank the members of our group. Hannah mentioned it's about 30 people now, faculty and staff across all the colleges and academic and student affairs, and hopefully you'll get a chance during the poster session to stop by. We have 2 posters, and we'll have some of the folks who participated in the spring study will be there to talk about their experience.
So we were interested in applying for a Hrabowski grant, and at first we thought we were going to be looking at an adaptation grant, which is taking something that exists somewhere else and adapting it to UMBC. But as we were looking at all the research, we were finding that no one else is really doing what it is that we're seeking to do. So we decided to go for the Research and Innovation Grant. And so that grant would allow us to fund graduate students over the next 2 years to really help us look at the tools that we're hoping will help us learn to measure affective development. So we knew that if we were going to get this grant, we needed to come into it with some sort of data, so we launched a pilot in the spring semester, and we knew that we probably weren't going to get great data, but we wanted to just get something, so we threw together a very quick Google form, which was going to be delivered pre and post to different experiences that were participating in the pilot. And so each pilot leader, mostly instructors, we also had service learning, so it was led by a member of the Shriver Center, and then a few different courses. They picked a bunch of AFCs, so they identified 2 to 3 AFCs and about 2 to 3 elements within those AFCs. And we created personalized forms for each experience. So we took the questions that we had developed for those elements and made a personalized form for each of those experiences. And so the questions were very basic. We took the definitions of the elements and just flipped them around into questions for quantitative data. And so an example would be for persistence. The question, or the definition of persistence, was confronts difficulties resolutely and perseveres in trying to manage them, reframes failures and mistakes as learning opportunities, and doesn't allow them to become disabling or discouraging, follows through on commitments. And the element definitions are very broad because we did get so much input, and so we wanted to make sure that everyone who provided feedback for these definitions, that their voices were heard, and so that's why it's such a broad definition of persistence. So then we flipped those statements into questions. So an example of those are, I am comfortable with challenges and find ways to manage them. When I make a mistake, I reflect on it and I'm able to learn from it. And when things don't work out the way I planned, I view this as a personal failure. And then students were asked to rank whether that's very untrue of them all the way up to very true of them. So the instructors of the different experiences were given the same survey to administer pre and post. And so we then took the data that we got from that. Oh, and I'm sorry, there was also a qualitative component of that. And so students were also asked to explain how they exhibited that element and just write a little story or share an anecdote reflecting on that and how they exhibit that. So, and Steve and Simon and Elisa can talk about the data that we got this summer.
Well, the data was very disappointing because our survey was, as Hannah said, quick and dirty. And I don't think we had the questions set up the way we needed to have them set up. Students found them confusing. The surveys, although I think the response rate was reasonable, the responses themselves were just not very informative on the whole, which precipitated a quite serious rethinking of the survey instrument for the second semester, this current semester, with the help of 2 graduate students, one of whom, Elisa, is here today. We did things like get rid of the definition. So originally students had seen the affective functional competency element that a faculty member was interested in assessing the acquisition of. But as you heard from Hannah, those are there's some jargon involved, a lot of sort of words that may mean different things to different people. So we got rid of those, and while we retained those as the basis for the questions that we asked, we made the questions much simpler. We can say a little bit about how the data we're getting back is perhaps better, but still disappointing. We've made different mistakes in the second iteration, which is progress. But I think Elisa can talk about the thinking that went into trying to improve the second version.
So what was really important for us is to standardize, make sure that everybody obtains the survey in the same format, in the same way, and during the same time points. We wanted to make sure that we had a pre and a post test so that we could measure variability and we could look at change over time of the students. So one of the things we implemented was actually giving something like 5 to 10 general questions that everybody was going to answer, so that we could see how different students in different experiences were to answer those questions and how this changed over time. And so one of the things we had to do was actually reformat the survey and add in items so that that could increase the reliability of our measure. And also we looked at face validity to make sure that everyone could understand the questions, and that when students were reading them, as well as professors who were administering them, would actually understand where these questions are getting at and which construct they're actually trying to measure. So the next steps that we have to take are actually to validate and to validate our measure and to check for reliability statistically. And one of the other things is to do a factor analysis to make sure that our items are actually loading onto the factors that we believe they should be loading onto. So that would either be confirmatory or exploratory factor analysis.
And I guess something I should have mentioned is what we ask of instructors is that they will think about the applied learning experience that they're offering and identify the up to 3 AFCs, right? The characteristics, the social characteristics that they might be building in their students, identify which ones they think their particular applied learning experience might develop, and then they will ask the questions of their students related to those, which means that, you know, if you have 4 or 5 different applied learning experiences, there may be very limited overlap between the questions being asked. So the global or universal questions that Elisa was mentioning are the questions that we insert into every survey so that we can get some sense of whether or not they're working the same in all classes. You know, if somebody just has a bum group of students who don't seem to develop over the course of the semester, we hope that we'll be able to tell that that's happening by the difference in their responses to the questions that everybody else has also answered. So not that this is being used to evaluate faculty at all, but we don't want faculty to be discouraged by the fact that their students appear not to have been benefiting if it just so happens that they had a lousy group of students that semester.
Now we can talk just a little bit about the longer term future that we're aiming for here before shutting up and asking you for feedback. But I guess as a way of segueing into that, I want to say that I'm the persistent optimist who was not disappointed by the data at all, in the sense that I wanted to go in with minimal assumptions. I think what we've discovered already, to a trained social scientist, was obvious, but also there was some stuff there that was just simple learning moments, making us recognize we were wording things too complex, that students literally didn't understand what we were asking them, just making us think it through from the ground up with minimal baggage. And I like that. I think we're learning a lot. And the best kind of, you know, I'm a biologist by training, and the best kind of data that I like is the stuff that frankly surprises me. And Simon has some beautiful examples, even this semester, of student responses where we're like, really? That's what you saw when we asked you this? I like that. I like that a lot. And I think as we move forward, Simon can talk about, well, do you want to mention the Spencer grant that you'd like to go for?
Right. So I think sophisticating and refining our survey instrument is going to be something that happens for several semesters still. It's pretty clear that we're not there yet. One major omission that I think has just become apparent to us is one of the major affective functional competencies we'd like to see students develop is empathy, and somehow we manage not to include that amongst those on the so far. So mistakes like that, I think, will emerge for quite a while. So we'll be working on refining our instrument, but the next step is to try and all the information we get from students is about, all the information we get from this survey is about student self-perception. So we're asking them if they think they are better team players than they used to be, if they are more critical agents than they used to be, if they think this, that, or the other about themselves. And ideally what we'll see is some kind of change from before to after the experience. Now, that change could take two forms. They could think they get better, or they could learn something about how little they already know by the end of the course and realize that they knew so little at the beginning that they ranked themselves lower at the end. And either of those, I think, would be interesting things to learn. But regardless, these will be self-assessments, and there are all sorts of problems with self-assessments. So the next step, the one step is improving our survey. The next step is to try and settle on one or more ways to assess the correctness or otherwise of students' self-perceptions, right? So to marry what they say about themselves with an assessment of some other form that is more objective and impartial than the assessment the students produce of themselves. So if students say, I've become a better team player, right, is that confirmed or disconfirmed by the assessment of an expert who observes the person who makes that claim participating as a member of a team? If somebody says, I've become more empathetic, is that reflected in some objectively accessible metric that someone on the outside can identify, right? So what we're going to try and do is figure out if students are good at assessing their acquisition of affective functional competencies, and if they're better at doing it for some of these AFCs than for others. So people might be better at figuring out when they become good team players because maybe they get feedback from other team players, right? And they can see the quality of projects improving depending on how sensitive they are and responsive they are to criticism. But people may not be good at developing empathy might be something that you are to a greater degree born with or without. It might not be something that you can learn as well. If we can figure out where students are good at assessing themselves and where students are not so good at assessing themselves, then we'll be able to rely more completely or less completely on the questions we ask them about themselves as sources of evidence. So we'll be applying to the Spencer Foundation, which is a foundation that makes sort of small grants for pedagogical research, to investigate ways in which we can try and operate these parallel paths of inquiry, right, where we ask students about themselves, but also how this will happen is what we would want to work on, but also have people assess students from a more objective, impartial perspective, so as to determine how good they are at self-assessment.
And then just finally, sort of moving even further ahead, a project like this is really going to have value if it is multi-year, which implies a much bigger grant. And so we're looking to see what is out there, and there are one or two institutions that show interest in this. I think that we feel that the way that this is going to have longevity through external funding is if we can begin to build these sorts of challenges towards a resolution, so that we have an instrument that we trust, we're getting data that's reliable, then we can start to do the sort of longitudinal tracking that is very interesting. Okay, affective learning. What does that actually do to a student? Perhaps most interestingly, when we look around universities of America, probably worldwide, there is such an emphasis on cognitive skills. Most university presidents will say, well, we want our students to gain integrity, to gain maturity, but when it comes down to it, we've got 5 cognitive functional competencies that we're measuring. There is no clear reason why affective learning should not be associated with maturation in cognitive competencies. In fact, a lot of the inspiration for what we're doing builds off of Tom Peniston's work, where he was looking at service learning through the Schreider Center and finding out students who engaged in classical service learning tended to graduate quicker, do better with the courses they took on, and so on. So I think that's the bridge that we see medium to long term as leading to a bigger grant that will sustain this in the sort of longitudinal study that would be of most benefit. Last thing of all to say is that okay, this is my wording, but so shoot me down anyone if you disagree. I like to see this as an alternative from a top-down implementation of a culture at UMBC. There could be an enormous amount of research, committee work, clever decisions, and 3 years later we're told to do something from the top echelons. This is much more of a living, breathing, flexible, bottom-up approach. Join it if you're interested. Work with us to iron it out and become a part of it, and let's see where it goes to. And if it starts to earn its place in terms of interest value and in terms of making you feel that you're able to demonstrate what your course is doing and why, then that's something that should spread naturally rather than be something that we're asked to do. And that's a vision that excites me for a way to institute change on campus. So thank you.
And I think in parallel to this research project, the work group is also looking to just identify all the different types of applied learning that are happening across campus, because they're all out there, but there's no cohesive way to identify what's happening. And so we're looking at identifying them, tracking them, assessing them, which is obviously this component, and then ways to enhance them, building that community of applied learning, and then ultimately rewarding participation on both the student end and the faculty staff end. Okay. Any questions?
I love the concept that you have of all different types of this kind of learning, from study abroad to. But in terms of measuring, of course, that makes things a lot more complicated. So do you define certain common factors that an experience has to have to be a part of this, and how are you conceptualizing that?
That's one of our goals moving forward, is to get to that point. We just haven't gotten there yet.
And I would say that's a great example of where, starting with minimal baggage, the data can lead us to those decisions rather than an a priori assumption or decision. This counts, that doesn't. Frankly, I'm very interested as a natural scientist to know whether flipped classrooms in biology as a type of applied learning are actually engendering affective competencies, because it's much more intuitive that working downtown in an area with specific needs is building them, but maybe there are other ways that we're building them. In the previous session of this panel, we were asked very much about the concept of a control group. Are we actually trying to measure for students who are not doing these? Well, I think by not defining them ahead of time, we're actually covering that to a large extent, because we're allowing the data to show us what courses are engendering what sorts of results. Maybe along the way we will define that into what could count as an applied experience, but there's a much richer context that is developing around that, which will allow us to ask, well, why is it that we find inquiry-based courses seem to build empathy, for example? Yeah.
And I think because they're taking on such a diverse form all across campus, we want to keep it as inclusive as possible now, and then kind of narrow down as we go.
Or not. I mean, we're not in the business of giving people black marks of exclusion, you know. Absolutely. Because I mean, if you think about the process for getting your course GEP registered, all you need to do is plausibly identify the cognitive functional competency that your course is, you know, if and this is really not where we're headed, but if we wanted to transcript, say, applied learning experiences, the bar might be just as high or low, depending on what you think, as that. Make a plausible case for your course's development of one or more of the affective functional competencies. I mean, it could go that way. But at the moment, anything goes. You know, if anybody who's interested in putting their course into the mix, regardless of the sort of depth or breadth of the applied learning experience component of it, is, you know, more than welcome.
Other questions?
Nobody else says that. So when you do the instrument with the students, do you prompt them that it's specifically around the applied experience, or is it more of the beginning of this course to the end of this course, or what kind of prompts do they have?
That's one of the things that has evolved considerably after the first semester of work, through people much more versed in social sciences than certainly the two of us in the middle are. We were understanding the importance of the incentives. We're still in live discussion about what form those incentives take, because, well, I'm going to steal words of John Fritz, who was in the previous panel, but he was saying you've chosen a very authentic incentive, which is simply trying to show up now, in the second run, at the start of the pre-survey, to talk to the students and engage them in this as a living research project. rather than enter a raffle for an iPad, which we'd strongly considered. Now, we're not ruling that out yet, but I think that is very much in flux at the moment, but we do sense after the pilot that it is crucial that we try to explain to the students and engage them in it. To give you the short answer I should have begun with, right now the questions, no, they're very, very general. How do you feel about this attribute? Yeah.
There's no paragraph that says, like, this is for the next project through the Schroeder Center. But that's something that will be worked into in the next couple
Because it turned out to be a logistical nightmare for us to get there in person. Hadn't actually thought that through. 12 sections of genetics, one of them gets cancelled, you know, it's like, yeah, we didn't manage that.
I mean, our hope was that in the pre-test, where students are asked to elaborate on how they are open to new experiences, they would say something, right? And in the post-test, they would say something about the experience and about how it had enhanced their ability to welcome new experiences. But you know, my intuitive sense, and I'm sure that a social scientist can explain why this is well, we didn't want to sort of push people in that direction and thereby bias the results by saying, you know, so in the previous 15 weeks, what's happened to improve your ability to welcome new? You know, we didn't want to ask that sort of a question. We just wanted to. We were hoping that organically people would say, this course has had such and such an impact on this particular affective functional competency.
We want to avoid social desirability when they're answering that.
There you go. That's what I meant.
See why we work with Elisa. Yeah, thank you. Sorry that we're not, but we're finding it fascinating to learn, if I can speak for Simon and myself. Honestly, it's fascinating watching this gentleman, who's one of the most grammatically correct speakers I know, working systematically over the summer to simplify sentences into things that sometimes were grammatically wrong, because that seemed to be what the students would understand better, right? Ending with prepositions and so forth. Yeah. Right? It hurt him.
And still, it's very difficult to get students to understand what you're asking for.
Yeah.
And Steve has actually alerted me to the fact that this is not a bad thing. But here's an example. So this is an example from the improved version of the survey instrument, where we asked students in this particular case about their openness to new experiences or something like that. So the student rated him or herself a 6 or 7 on the Likert scale of openness to, and then, you know, in the text box where he or she was invited to say something about that and to explain or justify the choice, he or she said something like, you know, I love using Google to find things out, which was not, you know, which to start with I thought was very disappointing, because that doesn't really seem to me to be an authentic openness to novelty, right? What Steve pointed out is that's a very valuable thing to know, because you know now you now know what that student's baseline is for openness to novelty, and if by the end of the semester they're like, going to West Baltimore was truly eye-opening for me, and has enabled me to what, you know, and has provided me with a sense of what it really means to encounter something foreign to oneself. That, you know, that would mark a genuine development and would be interesting. So I was disappointed, because that seemed to be such a sophomoric understanding of openness to novelty, but perhaps that's exactly the point, right? That's what you want to see at the beginning, in anticipation of a properly arranged applied learning experience resulting in a much deeper and more authentic understanding of what it means for something to be new and to welcome it at the end of the experience.
That makes me wonder if the students see their previous responses after they give you their post responses, to see if they can take, like, here's where you were at point A and here's where you got to.
Not yet, but we think it's coming.
We've been talking about that.
Right?
Yeah.
Sort of, honestly, different level of IRB approval to lack the anonymity that we can pair them up again. We just didn't see that coming.
Right.
And again, a trained social scientist would have done. But at least the data is leading us step by step by step. And I think even the chaos of those free text boxes last semester was deeply enlightening. Students had no idea what we were talking about. Students would actively misunderstand words that we suddenly realized were jargony because they were thought up by academics. So it's just so revelatory to see the crazy stuff that goes on in those free text boxes. Yeah. And I think it would be wonderful to pair them up and exactly that point. One of the things I've learned from Michelle, if I say anecdotally, correct me if this is from data, but it's that it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that to simply ask a student to reflect upon an affective aspect is to encourage growth in that aspect, right? And I find that fascinating. So I think that what you've just said is probably going to have an effect in itself, but that would be a fun thing to measure.
Yeah.
Thank you, metacognition. Right, there you go, metacognition.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
Wondering if you looked at the data for collective, because Simon mentioned going to West Baltimore, and then Stephen also mentioned the genetics class. I'm thinking the genetics class is a required class through their track, and I'm guessing the West Baltimore class is probably an elective.
Mm-hmm.
Just students self-selecting into classes that lead to more affective activities versus students that don't really have the ability to self-select into, like a genetics class, they have to take that.
So right now we're relying on the instructors and staff who lead the experiences to select into our group and the pile and the surveying. So it's not the students who are selecting in; it's at the
right. But they have selected.
Right, but they're
right. Yeah, and we're aware of that piece, and we there's an ongoing conversation about how do we expand beyond to reach students who wouldn't typically engage in these types of activities. We just haven't gotten there.
I think that the core courses could be particularly valuable for that reason. In the last panel, we sort of hovered for a few minutes around this concept very generally. We're not really good as a campus yet of being able to distinguish whether our innovations are having rebranding successful students with new names, or whether we're actually having impact on Joe, Jolene average in the middle. So I think the core courses could be revelatory there. Blunt answer is that last semester we didn't get enough quality data for that to be, it's moot now, but we hope it's not going to be very soon, right?
So your question is, you're assessing students who are in classes that are designed already to expose them to an applied learning experience. Are those the only students that we should be interested in asking about?
No, not necessarily. So I'm thinking students are in whatever class they choose. Some students choose elective classes because it sounds appealing to them for some reason. Some students choose classes because it's a required class in their trajectory. The discovery chemistry classes could be, the applied learning. Those students have to take those classes. The West Baltimore, I'm thinking of like one of our classes that our grad students did last semester was to do some active research in Cherry Hill. And clearly the students selected it because it sounded appealing to them.
Which is very different from
self-selecting into affective learning, but the discovery chemistry students are selecting because it's a required class.
So your interest is in figuring out whether selecting, whether choosing or having to, or being forced basically, results in different levels of affective functional competency acquisition?
Right. Well, so
interesting.
My research is on physical activity, and a lot of times we say our initiatives for physical activity just encourage people that are already physically active to be more physically active, and we don't really hit the people that aren't interested.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking like the chemistry students would be the ones that would be less
inclined to benefit. Yeah.
And just to prove how seriously thinking exactly the same lines, it actually will be the biology because it's the largest single major on campus by a factor of 2. So when you've got 1,500 students cramming to get their lab requirements done, they will be taking inquiry-based versions, even though they really wish they weren't. They will be the good ones to look at, won't they?
Right. And do they still have an option of choosing a traditional versus a...
It's sort of like a needs, it's going through the funnel. There's a certain number of seats, and they all want to get, particularly the pre-meds, this is anecdotal now, but they want to get into the traditional. They hate the inquiry-based one. We can't wait to measure what happens to them, right? Because we think they're learning more.
They still get to self-select. Do I want to be affectively influenced, or do I want to sit there passive?
Yeah, and it's not rocket science, but we do now have a box towards the end, tucked under the universal questions of other data, which says something about what was your motivation for taking this course. I'm hoping at the very least to pick up, well, you know, I was required to, versus I really wanted to work in Cherry Hill. Yeah. I mean, this is a great question. Please come and keep helping us improve what we're starting to measure as the tool becomes competent.
Right.
I wouldn't even say reliable yet.
I really wanted to just get through.
Yeah.
Or Discovery sounds fun, and my friend took it and they liked it.
Yeah.
I had similar thoughts, just in terms of majors. I mean, I'm a social work professor, so our students are required to do 2 semesters of field placement.
Right.
You go into the social work major knowing that.
Right.
Right, and our students are HAP students. They usually want to go help people. That's what they say they want to do.
Well, you can imagine here that spun right, with the help from people like you, this is where I think there are big grants, because there is so much richness here to be mined out. People just don't know at the moment whether inquiry-based biology is having anything like the same sort of impacts as service learning for somebody who's not motivated. Wouldn't that be interesting?
Well, and that's why it's so important that we do a pre-test and a post-test for all of the classes, whether they be selected or forced to be in that class. And that was one of the steps we had to take. We really had to just take back a whole step and make sure that everybody is doing the survey, pencil and paper this time, in front of professors, to make sure that it's being done, completed as much as possible, just so that we could measure their change over time, depending on whatever class they were in.
Wherever they first started.
And a silly little anecdote, but from years before this project, when I taught bioinformatics, I remember in my first year, when I hadn't prepped the course very well, set a disastrous homework that they were working on in lab and then taken home. But I suddenly realized on the front bench, because this is UMBC, there was an Orthodox Jew, a Muslim, and a frat boy really working together to try and figure out what on earth this idiot professor had meant. I don't want to rule that out from discovering what we as a campus are achieving by saying service learning counts, classic bioinformatics doesn't count. I really hope we don't do that, and I want to be surprised every which way if we can be. Yeah.
I have another thought, pulling it back to the pre and post perceptions of whatever the question is about. Because the goal would be that their perceptions have grown from the beginning to the end. And I can imagine a lot of students might just pick a number that they thought fit their current understanding.
Sounds like you.
And then they might forget what that number was when they see it 15 weeks later. And their perceptions about that scale might have expanded or changed in some way. But they might actually pick the same number, not knowing. So they might, basically what they might have thought, well, I probably, now that I know more.
That's a very good point.
Their previous one should have been a 3 instead of a 6, but they didn't know that, and so you're getting the same number back, but they are changing over time, but their perception of the scale has grown.
That's why it's important to have a mixed method study, to have that qualitative component, so that we have a better understanding of where their thoughts are going, because the Likert scale really does have its limitations. I mean, there's no way that we can capture that, except for by asking them to specifically talk about an experience that they had and how that relates to that effective learning experience.
But that really suggests that it would be useful for students to see what they said the first time around.
Thank you for that
Maybe
insight.
rate their previous.
That's
interesting.
Like, how would you now?
Knowing now what you know, what would you have
said?
what should you have said,
Right.
basically?
Should you have been a 6 or should you have been a 3?
Wow.
Yeah.
Because I mean, we all like when given a broad range, of course, we like to not be below average. Right? So if you choose 6 or 7,
there is a
less
bias
range.
there. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and students are very self-congratulatory.
Well,
Yeah.
we're humans.
That's what we've seen.
And of course, again, forgive me that probably most of you know this better than I did, even on this table, but Dr. Lee was explaining to me that in this early pilot work, one of the most common outcomes of true growth was more humility. So you actually, in the self-perception, it goes down, whereas an objective perception would go up, which is sort of just an exaggeration of what you've pointed out, right?
So then you have to operationalize your questions towards a more empirical base instead of an attitude.
Find some sort of secondary, third-party objective measurement, or something we can claim is more objective, would be the next step, we think, through the Spencer Foundation. Maybe there are other areas where, for reasons I can't fathom, they're actually pretty good at self-perception. I don't know. But that's obviously a growth step once we've got an instrument that we're kind of believing functionally, operationally, we know how to hand it out and get answers back. Thank you for all of these good insights.
We're just about finished, so if there are no other questions, thank you for coming.
Yeah, that's very helpful.